This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
I'm glad that you have joined us today as we continue our series of lessons on the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be again in Matthew chapter 5 today as we continue the series, and we're looking at the next section where Jesus is going to talk about the kingdom citizen and his relationship to His Word. Not the Word of God, not the Lord's Word, but a man's relationship to his own Word, the truth. I don't know if your childhood was much like mine, but when it came to promises, and promises that you either had to keep or didn't have to keep, a lot of that hinged on whether or not you had your fingers crossed when you made the promise. When I was a kid, you could promise anything that you wanted to promise, things that you could never fulfill even if you wanted to. But technically, the unwritten rule was that if you made a promise and when you made it your fingers were crossed, you were under no obligation to keep that promise. So if you promised your little buddy that you would give him your favorite toy, when he went to collect on that promise, you could get out of it by saying, I had my fingers crossed. It didn't count. So crossing your fingers as a kid basically would render the truth completely irrelevant. It would render your word irrelevant. And so that's the concept that I want for you to keep in mind as we look at what Jesus had to say about the taking of oaths and what the people had been taught by word and by practice from the scribes and the Pharisees, and how their lack of appreciation for their own word was contrasted with what Jesus wanted them to do and how He wanted them to think about the concept of truth and keeping their word. So let's look at that in Matthew chapter 5. We'll look at verses 33 through 37. Jesus said, Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is His footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King, nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. So here Jesus has done, as He already has in these previous sections that we've studied, by making a contrast between here's what you've heard and here's what I say to you. And with regard to these oaths, what they had heard, according to verse 33, is don't swear falsely. Follow through with your promises. Whatever you have sworn to do, keep that promise. Perform your oath to the Lord. All right, that's what they had heard. That's what the scribes and the Pharisees had taught. And now, I want us to remember that that is the context in which Jesus is making these statements. Remember that in chapter 5, verse 20, which we said in previous lessons is one of the keys, it's really the key to this section in chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount, and one of the keys to the entire sermon. And that was when Jesus said in verse 20 of Matthew chapter 5, For I say to you, that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And that was the introductory statement to this section of the sermon, where Jesus is reminding them, you have to live your life in a way that shows that you've got it together better than the scribes and the Pharisees. We talked about how that would have been a very shocking statement because the general populace looked up to the scribes and Pharisees religiously because they were the ones that were supposed to know the law and obeyed the law, all of that. So they were kind of looked up to. So when Jesus said, you've got to exceed their righteousness, that was a startling statement. And as it pertains to these oaths, we have to remember that that, again, is the context in which He is making this statement. So when He says, here's what you've been taught, He's referencing what the scribes and the Pharisees taught about the taking of oaths. And their idea about keeping their word was a far cry from the idea that the Lord had about that same topic. They actually had an elaborate system of oath-taking rules that basically, in essence, was like we had when we were kids with crossing our fingers. Their elaborate system of oath-taking and swearing by this and swearing by that was so intricate that they could create these scenarios in which they took oaths, in which they were promising to do things, but when all was said and done, they didn't have to keep their promises, according to them, because they had worded their oath in a particular way, and things like that, that basically rendered their word without value. And so that's what they were teaching. Depending on what you swore by would have a bearing on whether or not you really had to keep your promise. Let me call your attention to another passage in the book of Matthew where Jesus explains this even further. And that's in Matthew chapter 23. And in that chapter, in verses 16 through 22, Jesus kind of expounds on this concept of oath-taking and explains some of this intricate detail that they had in their oath-taking rules. Matthew 23, beginning in 16. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by Him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and Him who sits on it. So you see here, Jesus calls attention to how they had created this system where, for example, you could swear by the altar if you wanted to, and if you did that, these rules applied, and if you swore by the gift that was on the altar, then these other rules applied, and if you swore by the temple, then certain rules applied. If you swore by the gold in it, then it was a different set of rules that came into play. And so you had all of this system. And when Jesus said to the people, back to the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, when Jesus made that point, here's what you've heard, they knew exactly what He was talking about. Remember crossing our fingers as a kid? That's what they were doing. In a different way by having these stated oath rules, but it was the same principle that we had when we were kids. If you crossed your fingers, you didn't have to keep your word. Well, according to them, if you swore this way or that way and used this word or invoked this name, then you didn't have to really keep your promise. You weren't obligated to keep it. So please remember that when you look at what Jesus says. So when He said to them, you have heard that it was said, here's what you've been taught. They knew exactly what they had been taught. They knew the system, and they knew the way that the scribes and the Pharisees dealt with oath-taking. And so that's what they knew, that's what they'd been taught. Now Jesus turns and says, here's what I say. Here's what you missed. I know what you've been taught. Here's what you missed. And in essence, they missed the importance of the truth. When you've created such an elaborate system like they had, swear by this, you don't have to keep your promise, swear by this, you do, and all of that, it basically renders the truth irrelevant. And Jesus wants to call their attention back to the importance of speaking what's true and letting your word be your bond. And so if we're going to be citizens of His kingdom, and that again is what the whole sermon is about, what a citizen of the kingdom of Christ is like, what their characteristics are. If we are going to be a citizen of the kingdom of Jesus, then we have to put a premium on truth, put a premium on our word, and let our word be our bond. So you could basically summarize the section there in chapter 5, beginning in verse 34, when Jesus forbids this swearing. You could basically summarize that, the rest of that, by Jesus saying to them, stop playing games with the truth. Get rid of all of these intricate systems whereby you don't have to keep your word. Just stop playing games with the truth. And stop crossing your fingers. If you say yes, then mean yes. If you say no, then mean no. But when you get into all of these different rules of oath-taking, he said that kind of stuff is not from God, it's from the evil one. So that's what they were missing. And in that whole intricate system, they had simply lost sight of the importance, the primacy of truth. So when Jesus said, don't swear, Jesus was not forbidding proper oaths, and we'll see what that is in a moment. He was not forbidding proper oaths, but He was forbidding the kind of oath-taking, the kind of swearing that they had been taught by the scribes and the Pharisees. That's what He's prohibiting. See, I know that some people have looked at the words of Jesus here when He says, swear not at all, and they've taken that to mean an absolute thing whereby there's no circumstance under any situation where a child of the kingdom could take an oath. I appreciate the fact that folks want to do what the Lord says, and they don't want to disobey Him and do things that He's forbidden. But in truth, I don't believe that Jesus is making a blanket statement, given the context, against all oath-taking. I think He's forbidding the kind of oath-taking that those people had been taught by the scribes and Pharisees. And one of the reasons why I believe that's the case is because you have to harmonize what Jesus says here with the rest of what's said in the Bible about the taking of oaths. And what we find in both Old and New Testaments is that there is a proper place for the taking of a solemn and serious oath. And I want to call your attention to some of those examples from both Old and New Testaments. First of all, consider some passages from the Old Testament that speak approvingly of the taking of oaths. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 20. Even says in the form of an imperative, a command, you shall take oaths in His name, in the name of God. That is stated further later in the prophets, Jeremiah chapter 12. And there are other passages too in the Old Testament. Just want to bring these to your attention before we move further. That there are passages in the Old Testament that enjoin the taking of oaths. Now they're to be done seriously, and you're supposed to keep them, but they were all right to take. In the New Testament, you have examples of oaths. The Apostle Paul took oaths all the time in his letters. They would take different forms. For example, in Romans chapter 1, verse 9, Paul writes, God is my witness, that thus and so is the case. He uses the same wording in Philippians chapter 1, verse 8. God is my witness. Well, what is he doing when he calls God as witness? Well, he's taking, that's a form of an oath. In 2 Corinthians 1 verse 23, he says, I call God to witness against my soul. Again, what is that? Well, it's invoking the name of God in a very serious and solemn way, but he is taking an oath. I think about the 6th chapter of the book of Hebrews, where we find there that even God Himself has taken an oath. Now, if oath-taking as such, if there's something inherently immoral and evil about taking any kind of an oath, then we've got a problem with the fact that God has taken an oath. And if it was immoral and evil in and of itself, then we would have to charge God with having committed sin. But notice in Hebrews chapter 6, beginning in verse 13, we have these words, For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. There was no one greater for God to appeal to in taking an oath, so he didn't swear to anyone greater than himself, but he swore by himself and made a promise and took that oath. Surely I will bless you and multiply you. And then verse 15, and so after he had patiently endured, Abraham, he obtained the promise. For men, the writer goes on to say, men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of the promise the immutability of His counsel, confirmed it by an oath, and that by these two immutable things, God's promise and God's oath, we have hope as an anchor of the soul, he goes on to say. But my point in bringing up Hebrews 6 is the fact that God has taken an oath in the past. And so it must not be inherently evil and sinful. And then I think about Jesus when He was on trial. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 63, one of the rulers that had Jesus on trial, Pilate, said to Jesus in that passage, I adjure you to tell us if you're the Christ. When he says, I adjure, A-D-J-U-R-E, he means by that, I put you under oath. And some translations of the New Testament even have it spelled out that way. I put you under oath to tell us whether you're the Christ. Now, if you look in Matthew 26, you don't see Jesus saying, wait a minute, you can't do that. You don't have the authority to do that, and I don't allow you to do that. No, He didn't argue with him over that. He just dealt with the question as it was. He was placed under judicial oath, which implies then that a judicial oath is not something that's sinful. Some people are very concerned about being in a situation like, for example, entering into the military, where you're required to raise your right hand and take an oath of allegiance and to your military service, to your country. And sometimes people are skittish at times about being in a court of law, for example, and you're going to be placed on the witness stand and you have to raise your right hand and take an oath that you're going to tell the truth. And some, based on the words of Jesus here, have concluded, and I think erroneously so, that kind of thing is forbidden, that it would be sinful to do that. Well, I don't believe that's the case at all. I think under a judicial thing and in a very serious and solemn way, it's not sinful in and of itself for a person to take an oath. God's desire with regard to oaths has always been focused on two major criteria: sincerity and faithfulness. Sincerity in that He wants us to be truthful. If we are placed under oath, be sincere, really mean what you're saying. And then in the second place, with faithfulness, be diligent in keeping the promise, because God's going to hold you accountable. If you give your word to do something, then you need to keep that word, because God will hold you accountable. So sincerity and faithfulness are the things that God wants emphasized with regard to oaths. Now here's the issue when we get back into the context of the Sermon on the Mount. The scribes and the Pharisees had failed on both counts. When it came to sincerity and to faithfulness, in actually meaning what you say and saying what you mean, and then when you take an oath, keep it, they had failed on both counts. They weren't being sincere when they were making their promises. Many of them, they were crossing their fingers. They weren't being sincere. They were wording their oaths in a certain way according to their contrived ideas, and they weren't serious about making those promises. And then when it came to trying to being expected to keep them, they weren't keeping them. So a lack of sincerity and a lack of faithfulness characterized the kinds of oaths that the scribes and the Pharisees took. And Jesus said, that's what you've been taught. You've heard that it was said. But I'm telling you, stop playing games with the truth. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Now when we think about today, and we live in a culture where a lot of people very flippantly, without sincerity and without the kind of solemn thought that they need to have, take oaths all the time, calling upon God to witness practically everything. And when a person does that, when they call God as witness to anything and everything in life, it cheapens and devalues a genuine oath when it is taken and properly used. Think about this example for just a moment about how overusing something can cheapen it when it's used in a good and proper way. Think about being in a courtroom, for example, and let's say you hear the bailiff in the courtroom talking about things in the room, and he refers to the honorable chair, and he refers to the honorable pen that sits on the honorable table. And next to that honorable table is the honorable filing cabinet, in which are very honorable files. And it's the honorable this, the honorable that, everything that he sees is honorable. And then the judge comes in and he refers to the honorable judge. Well, if the pen and the file folder and the filing cabinet and the chair and if all of those things are honorable, then why should I have much respect for the judge if the judge is no better than the chair and the pen and the filing cabinet? So when you overuse something like that, it cheapens the value of things when you try to use it later in a proper fashion. People have done that with God by their flippant use of His name, by their flippant invoking of His name with regard to anything and everything. You know, if a person swears to God over everything from the gasoline price that they were able to find, the cheap gasoline price, and they say, I found this very cheap price, and they swear to God that they found that price so cheap, or if it's their golf score or the size of the fish that they caught. You know, if we invoke the name of God and swear by the name of God about everything from the minutest thing to everything else, it cheapens the solemnity that God has placed on the taking of oaths. And it constitutes a very clear example of invoking the name of God in vain, which God has always prohibited. When we invoke the name of God, God has always required, and rightly so when you consider His majesty and His holiness and His greatness. We don't take the name of God in vain. We don't take the name of God and use it in a flippant way and just throw it around like you would throw around any common word. But that's what so many people do. And it's a tragedy. Truth should be so important to the citizen of the kingdom of Christ that citizen should not feel compelled to bolster his statement, almost his every statement, by invoking the name of God and making a flippant oath. You ever wonder why so many people think that it's important for them and perhaps even necessary for them in their own minds to invoke the name of God so often and so flippantly? Ever wonder why people think that they need to do that? I suppose with most folks who do it, they don't even think about it. It's become so much of a habit that they don't think about why they're doing it. But what about initially, when people start to use the name of God and invoke His name in flippant ways? Why do they do that? Could it be because that they know that their simple affirmation of fact is not going to be trusted, even by their own friends? Do you think that could be why? I think maybe it is, that they state some fact and they feel like they've got to back it up by swearing to God because they don't think they're going to be believed unless they do that. Well, why won't they be believed? Is it because in other circumstances their word means so little that they feel like now they've got to bolster it by invoking the name of God? It was A.M. Hunter who was credited with having said, "Oaths arise because men are so often liars." I believe that's true. And what a sad state of affairs it is. And so when Jesus addresses this matter here, in the context of the scribes and the Pharisees, and that is the context, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. You see, they often spiced up their everyday language with flippant, meaningless oaths that meant nothing. It rendered their word completely irrelevant. And because their word was so irrelevant in other circumstances, they tried to spice up their promises with these oaths when they couldn't be believed anyway. We ought to be so committed to truthfulness that people know us as individuals who say what they mean and mean what they say. People whose yes means yes and whose no means no. And stop invoking the name of God in flippant ways and in meaningless ways. We need to have much more respect for the name of God, for the person of God, for the holiness of God, for the majesty of God. And we should have such a devotion to truth that we don't feel like we need to punctuate our every statement by saying, "I swear to God," or I promise this is the case." We really shouldn't need to do any of that if our word is always our bond. So Jesus said to them, stop crossing your fingers, stop playing games with the truth. And that's my admonition to you today, to think about what your relationship to the truth is. Are you a person of your word? Are you a person who can be trusted? Are you a person who makes promises and keeps them? Or are you known by even your close friends and associates as somebody who can't be trusted? They may tell you they're going to do something, but you never do it. Don't be that person. You want to be a citizen of the kingdom of Christ. Keep your word and don't play games with the truth.
This is a production of World Video Bible School.